I have a nephew who's going to be 21 soon. I've never raised a child of my own, so my relationship to him and watching him grow up is the closest I've come. And because I'm not quite his mother, but I'm a little more than a stranger, we've enjoyed a very open and a positive relationship. Naturally, like all the parents that I have watched, I have this hope somehow that this young person of the next generation will become wildly enthusiastic about the things that I'm enthusiastic about. I've watched so many parents tell me how deeply spiritual their children are and how absolutely certain they are that they're going to be on this spiritual path. And I've watched with a kind of impartial awareness to just see how it actually unfolds, then ridiculously watch myself act out the same sort of bias, because attachment is like that. And when we love something, we naturally want other people to love it also. In fact, Swamiji went so far as to explain that the reason God made creation, which is always the big question, why is it the way it is? In fact, I recall my friend Shivani once, after a long seclusion, went to Swamiji and she just had one question and she just planted herself in front of him as if she was not going to move until he gave her the answer. Swami Kriyananda is the founder of Ananda Community, for those of you who don't know. And she said to him, she just said, "Why?" like this. And Swamiji said, "What difference would it make even if you knew?" Which was an interesting answer, because the answer meaning, if you're trapped inside the cave, really the reason you got trapped in that cave is less important than finding the door out, isn't it? Once you're on the outside, you have the leisure then to sort of contemplate the philosophical niceties of how you ever got there in the first place. But if you're damp and cold and hungry and miserable, basically you want it to stop. But the answer that Swamiji gave about why God created the world is, he said, it is the nature of joy to want to share itself. And so the Indian scriptures say, the divine wanted to enjoy itself through many. Of course, the obvious answer to that is it's not enjoying itself through very many. Many of them are not having a good time at all. But coming back to my point of view, having been a young person at one time myself, not so distantly that I can't remember it, having struggled through the effort to find meaning in life, if one has found a path that seems suitable, one naturally desires to share that with those that one loves. Of course, the obvious problem is that we're not all one person. Ultimately, spiritually, we may all be one, but in this extraordinary diversity of individual karma and the trajectory of our life, just look around. I mean, not one of us would mistake oneself for someone else, would you? We can name each of these individual people if we know their names, or at least we can number them and still know which ones they are, because we're just not the same. And this whole physical manifestation is a manifestation of our consciousness. The reason we look so different is because the physical extends from the vibration that we have inside. So my young nephew, when he was younger and more easily malleable by a slightly charismatic aunt, made me think that he was in fact just inches away from embracing the spiritual path. As the lad has developed his own point of view, he's manifested to me that he's not going to be a clone of me, rats, And more than that, has manifested, like all of us, that he has his own strong karmic inclinations, even karmic attachments. I recall once there was this young woman from Stanford who came here for a while, with whom I felt a great connection, and I had high hopes that she would get on this spiritual path. And we had such an amusing conversation one day, because she had this deep desire, which she went ahead and followed. She wanted to marry, she wanted to have a family, she sort of had all this picture of happiness in the more, what I can only call more conventional way, that she was deeply attached to, and she was attracted to this spiritual path, but terrified that if she embraced this path, she would lose that. And I had to laugh, because my progress through the same years was 100% the opposite. My absolute deepest fear was that I would just end up married with a family and with a house and with all the elements of conventional happiness. I thought, if nothing rescues me, that's where I'm going to end up. It used to personify for me I guess when my childhood, they used to have those station wagons that had the wood sides. I mean, those of you who are as old as I am remember those. They're way out of fashion, but they had wood sides. And I used to actually, it was a virtual nightmare that I would be driving one of those. And for some reason, the husband I envisioned was always a dentist. And I would have several children and a dog in the back of that station wagon. And I would be just like a living cadaver just driving that thing around. So it was so remarkable to me to have this lovely young woman basically describe that as her ideal and her great fear that she would lose it. And I thought, my, isn't life amazing? Well, back to my nephew, who will no doubt hear this and be amused. At one point, he sincerely expressed to me that he had ambitions, and they were laudable ambitions. He's a good man. But they were ambitions that, in his mind, precluded a spiritual search. So, he being born as a lawyer, from the age of about 2, he seemed to understand the method of legal argument as a technique he used against his mother very consistently, which caused it to be a near-death experience for her to raise him. But in any case, and I, being somewhat versed in the same art, we would go at it. But I talked to him about his various ambitions, and I said, what do you find to be the greatest obstacle to your ability to achieve what you want to achieve? And thoughtfully, he went through it, and he finally had to say honestly, myself. The fears that I have, laziness, confusion about what the right path is, inability to concentrate. I mean, gradually we sort of made this long list. And I said, so isn't it true that if you could first master yourself, and by that I mean to be able to direct your energy as you choose to direct it, doesn't it seem obvious that everything else would naturally follow from that? Now, I can't say that that converted him immediately to the spiritual path, but the irrefutable logic of it is there, isn't it? Now, when Jesus says to us, seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all these things shall be added unto you, there's many, many different ways to interpret that. But when we start talking about it, combined with an understanding of what the spiritual path is from a yogic point of view. Now, yoga is the science of self-realization. Yoga yoga techniques are those methods that we use in order to gain mastery over our flow of energy. Because when we stand back and really try to ask, who am I and what makes me who I am, and all the different things I was saying about all these different people, what we really are, what defines us, is the flow of our energy. Isn't that so? What it is directed toward, the quality of it, the quantity of it, what we experience from one another is that flow of energy, whether it's expressing outwardly or merely coursing through us inwardly and creating a magnetism that we feel. When we meet people, when we see one another, long before anything else happens, we have a sense of who we're dealing with. It comes through the eyes, it shows in the posture, in the way a person presents themselves. There's a flow of conscious energy that makes us what we are. That's why in the Bhagavad Gita it says, that which we worship, we become. Now, worship in this sense means that which we focus our energy on. When you worship something, your attention is drawn toward it, and you act in accordance with that commitment. Some people worship art, some people worship aesthetics, some people worship intellectuality, some people worship an image of God, some people worship family. But what that means is that's where we put our energy. We can sort of make a long list. Sometimes we just worship sleep, or intoxicants, or we worship unconsciousness, in that we put most of our energy toward trying to be unconscious, isn't it? But we have all these different commitments that we place on the altar of our lives, whether we call it that or not, and then everything circulates around that. Sometimes people worship fear. Some worship anxiety. Some worship self-protection. and some worship money. There's all kinds of different things. But whatever we worship, that becomes the magnetic point or points that draw energy from us. And as we put that energy out, that's who we become. It's very interesting sometimes. People, for example, who are visual artists, often you'll see that they have this particular energy in their eyes because they live through life through their eyes. Some people who are very intellectually oriented, mentally oriented to the point even that they may not relate to life in any other way, you'll sort of see sometimes even their eyes have a certain inward-looking quality because they're much more concerned with the ideas going on inside their head, really, than anything outside of themselves. One man at Ananda Village who was notorious for being very unconscious about the world around him. He wasn't so much intellectual as just indifferent. And he was once giving a public talk, and he said, well, you know, if you could see the world as I see it, and then he paused for a moment. He said, well, then you probably wouldn't see much of it at all. Just describing it. That's just the way he lived. But we reflect these realities. If we devote ourselves to playing music, then music becomes just the nature of us. If we devote ourselves to being a mother, a friend of mine has 3 children, and when they were small, she took a holiday from her children, left them with their father, and came with us on a pilgrimage to India. And a few days into that trip, I was with her, and her name was Susan. I said, Susan, you just look so different. I've never seen you look like this. And she sort of smiled and said, you have never seen me with my aura intact, is the word she said. She said, it has been totally distributed to those 3 children. This is the first time, since they were born that I have been able to be myself. The children were the center of her altar, and that's what she became. Now, this is an amazingly simple and interesting point, because what it also reinforces is this idea that Swami Kriyananda has emphasized a number of times, that we simply are what we identify with. And it's very important to understand how completely mutable what we call ourselves actually is. Because you see, a flow of energy is just that. A flow of energy can become habitual, because if we keep going down the same channel, then that channel is deep, and when we're not putting out much energy, it just falls down that same hole over and over again. But nonetheless, it's just a flow of energy that goes in a certain way by habit, which means absolutely everything about ourselves, up to and including our physical bodies, if we have the power, is all just a question of where we direct energy, which means that as soon as we make that decision to shift our energy to another direction, then all we have to do is do it. And nothing prevents us from doing it. Swamiji once said, the difference between a saint and the greatest saint and the worst sinner is simply the way they behave. Which sounds kind of like, well, of course it is. But what he's saying is that there's no inherent difference within us. It's just a question of what we do with the consciousness that we have. Swamiji once, when we were in the middle of a time of tremendous persecution, and Ananda was just being tormented through the courts by very unscrupulous people. And Swami Kriyananda was quite brave through all of it, but one day it sort of got to him. And he described to us later that he was meditating, and he was praying to Babaji, who's the figure at the top of our altar here, who's a yogi in the Himalayas, who is a still living yogi. He's what's known as a deathless master. And Swamiji was praying to Babaji and saying, I can understand that difficulties have to come, but why are you allowing these extremely unscrupulous people to have power over me? Because that was the circumstances we're in. There's nothing honorable about them, but you're giving them power over me. Why are you doing that? And Swamiji said the answer that came to him, he felt Babaji's voice within him. And Babaji said, they're all my children. Isn't that an interesting way to put it? And Swamiji just realized, no, it's I who say this one is bad, this one is good, that one is unscrupulous. And clearly the behavior was unscrupulous. But from the point of view of the divine, we're all God's children. Some of us are God's naughty children. That's the truth. But even the naughtiest child sometimes is the most loved. Isn't that so? Because the mother and the father's heart has to go out constantly trying to save that one. So who's to say? When the naughty child decides to become good, there's nothing preventing him from being good except that decision. So now, Jesus tells us, whatever it is that we're seeking, seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all this will be added unto us. And what that's saying is, put at the center of your altar of worship that which has the greatest power to give back to you. That which has the greatest power to transform us from what we're not enjoying into what we want to enjoy. Because once that relationship is firmly established, once heart, mind, and soul is centered on that divinely moving flow of energy, then all of these other little concerns, anxieties and fears and nervousnesses and uncertainties, all of them dissolve. And whatever it is we then choose to put our energy toward, that power comes to us. In the early years of Ananda, I was fortunate enough to come when I was 24 years old. And I moved at that time from San Francisco, where I was living, up to the only Ananda community that existed then, which is still the home community, the first community of Ananda, which is near Grass Valley. Now it is almost 1,000 acres of land and several hundred people. When I went there, it was about 50 or 60 people. We had just maybe 100 or 2 acres of land, not nearly as much. And we had almost nothing. I mean, we just had nothing but this image of what we were going to build. We had land, we had a few old buildings. We lived in trailers and teepees and tents and buildings made out of plastic. We had managed for many years to sort of be under the radar of all county requirements, which was the grace of God, because otherwise the community could never have gotten off the ground. By the time we were forced to conform to the hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of legal requirements, we were already solidly into the ground there. But the reality of that situation was very interesting because, let me see what the point is here. Because the future of Ananda was not at all obvious. It was obvious to Swami Kriyananda in his vision of it. And there was a certain kind of faith that he was able to convey. But the rest of it was really, really awful. I remember, I think it was David and Karen who told me when their parents came to visit, one of their parents came to visit, and they sat around the wood stove in the teepee and reminisced about the Depression. That was sort of like what occurred to them, looking at what was nothing, very little more than a tent city. People slogging through the mud and not having cars and not having proper homes and living on hand-me-down clothes. And so they reminisced about, the hard times they had known. And another parent walking around there just, we were so proud of what we had built. Look, Mom, look at this outhouse. I helped make this outhouse. And you see how we've pasted all these nice pictures of scenic things inside the outhouse? Isn't it just really the finest outhouse? And most of the young people there had dropped out of prestigious colleges. So the parents were less than enthusiastic to see the work that we were now doing. And there was very little work of any quality of what our parents expected us to do, because it was coming from the ground up. So you were either a gardener, a cook, or a carpenter. That was pretty much the choices that you had, because that was about all the work there was. And in fact, as sometimes new people would come and they would feel just a little like their talents weren't being recognized. Ananda, who was one of the gardeners, had a master's degree in city planning. And she would sort of say sympathetically, yes, some of us are a little overqualified for the work that we're doing. Here's your hoe, go weed. And in fact, Jyotish made an apocryphal story. This was only a joke, but this couple arrived and they were sort of gypsies, hippie gypsies, and they hung out with us for a while. And they made a living. His father ran a company where he manufactured vacuum cleaners for swimming pools. And this couple made the canvas bags that went inside those machines. And they would make them from wherever they were in the country and just ship them back to his factory. So they set up a little sewing machine factory in this absolutely just wreck of a room in this old shed that was on the property there. I mean, really, it looked like some place that you would hesitate before you put your tractor. But we had this factory up there, and you would sit there all day and you would sew straight seams on these vacuum cleaner bags. And you'd get paid, maybe as much as 50 cents an hour for doing this. So Jyotish had this imaginary thing where a guest came and saw someone sewing these vacuum cleaner bags and said, "Did you have any experience sewing before you came to live at Ananda?" And she said, "Yes, I used to be a brain surgeon." I mean, that was sort of about the level that we were working at. And we were young, ambitious people and had the thought that we were going to do great things in the world, and just found ourselves cooking and sewing and gardening and hammering nails, just doing nothing that we thought we were going to do. So it was often a real challenge between all of our ambitions and our dreams and our desires and our feeling of commitment to this spiritual path, of commitment to Swami Kriyananda as a spiritual teacher, by extension, a commitment to this project of building a community, and just the sheer impossibility of getting from where we were to the place where we thought all that we had to give could be given. Do you understand? Do you see what the difficulty is? How often in our lives, you see, we face that. We have these ambitious dreams. We even have an inner sense of my destiny, what I'm supposed to do. But traversing that space. Now, it's pertinent to realize how many young people have dreams and how many older people have disappointed dreams. That's one of the clues that God plants in this. How few dreams are actually realized. Swami often tells us that chilling fact that someone once did an interview of people in their 40s and asked them what their most happiest moment was, and a terrifyingly large number said their high school prom. Because you see, on your high school prom, it's all just, oh, I'm going to be rich, I'm going to have money, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. By the age of 40, all the incredible obstacles to that success have begun to weigh down the possibility. But not those who dedicate themselves first to the spiritual path. And now the history of Ananda has been so remarkable because the principle that it's at work here is the principle that Jesus said. If you seek first the kingdom of God, everything else will be added unto you. Because what that does is that puts at the center of your altar the one thing that can give you power. And I don't mean a God who's pleased because you work in this way. I mean a relationship with your own inner self. The source of our own power. Look to the source of all things if you would conquer fear and weakness. That's what we say in the Festival of Light every week, isn't it? Did you think that this power was your own? And then the little bird says, well, how can I find that source? Look inside yourself. If you would conquer fear and weakness. That's what Jesus said. Seek ye first the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God is not following the rules so that when you die, you'll have a bigger house in heaven. As one of my little Catholic friends was said, when he was a little boy and they told him to be good, and he had no desire to be good. So he asked the nuns who were telling him, well, what will I get from being good? A bigger house in heaven, they said to him. At which point he ceased to be a Catholic. It took him a little longer to extricate himself because he was still small, but that was it for him. You know? But what yoga promises, and what Jesus promised, is put first on the center of your altar the divine power within you. And do everything, have all the energy in your life directed toward realizing that. Serve, raise your family, do your art, earn money if you want to. But make sure that what you're doing is living for righteousness, living for goodness, living for bliss, making the rule of your life. Seek ye first the kingdom of God, the power and the presence of the divine within you. Then you see everything else, not only will it come to you out of some divine reward system, but we ourselves are able to manifest it then, because the power of that spirit becomes our own. I have found it so remarkable to look back now over the years. And I will never say I was never tempted away from my primary dharma, my primary responsibility, which was to be a devotee, to work to realize Master's dream of cooperative communities and of this work of Ananda. I was never seriously tempted away from it. But every once in a while, I would feel within myself a need for some reality or experience that seemed incompatible with the situation I was in. And the only way that I would be able to achieve that would be to turn my back on my first commitment. In other words, to shift the object of my altar ever so slightly. And because that would be required, I was never tempted. But I was curious to see how it would unfold. I can only speak from experience, but I speak from profound and real experience. I'm rendered speechless with gratitude to look back and realize that every single talent, every single desire, every single longing that I've had in this life has come to me. Seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all these things shall be added unto you.